But somehow this has to be national, and it has to reach all regions, and it has to reach all Canadians.
What are the rights of Canadian citizens?
The stories that people bring to the country as immigrants shapes us as a nation as well.
It's equally important to bring to the table the very dark history of institutionalization, of violence, of exclusion.
There's so much, there's just racism everywhere, and it needs to be addressed and it needs to be looked at.
I happen to believe that we do have a responsibility to the rest of the world.
What can we do together in Canada to be a stronger nation? It's about Canada. Within the architecture of the Constitution has grown a human rights culture stronger at some times than others. Final written report, Content Advisory Committee.
Canada already exists with a number of unique
Louis Cardinal, Indigenous Media Institute of Canada, interviewed in Edmonton, Alberta.
Amongst ourselves and between ourselves about these rights, we will never truly understand the grandeur of Canada and what it really offers.
We as Indigenous peoples in this place called Canada.
Beverly Jacobs, Mohawk Nation, interviewed in Calgary, Alberta.
By a foreign system that has enforced its laws, have enforced its institutions on our people without our consent.
I'm not going anywhere. This is my country. This is my province.
Muriel Stanley Venn, Aboriginal Commission on Human Rights Justice, interviewed in Calgary, Alberta.
Right that I have been trying to exercise over my entire life.
Why do we keep a poison like this in Canada's social web? Claude Picard, Huron-Wendat Nation, interviewed in Quebec City, Quebec. The Acadian deportation that took place in 1755. This deportation clearly took away families which had been settled on land for decades and exported them elsewhere. Eric Doucet, Société Nationale de l'Acadie, interviewed in Moncton, New Brunswick. Francophones haven't been around for 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 8 generations in Canada. Francophones were here even before the Canadian Constitution. Therefore, French and English are Canada's 2 primary languages. If I move to Canada, both people should welcome me, as well as Indigenous people. Claire Lapointe, professor at Université de Laval, interviewed in Quebec City, Quebec.
People of African descent have been here as long as either one of those 2 others.
Irvin Carvery, Africville Genealogy Society, interviewed in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
From the road systems, to the highway systems, to the railroad systems, to the port systems, people of African descent built those.
Our grandfather came here in 1906.
Albert Lee, photographer, Growing Up Chinese in Halifax exhibition, interviewed in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
He came over in 1916 where he had paid a head tax of $500, which was quite a considerable amount of money at the time.
Dorothy Williams, historian, interviewed in Montreal, Quebec.
My grandparents.
Arthur McKee, leader Japanese-Canadian Redress Campaign, interviewed in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
The railroad workers, what's happened to
Chris Ramsaroop, Justicia for Migrant Workers, interviewed in Toronto, Ontario.
And that's playing out itself again with these workers.
When you have citizenship, you are
Don Chapman, The Lost Canadians, interviewed in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
You have no right of judicial review to challenge the government. You have no right of a land, a home, protection, police protection, nothing.
Until and unless you belong to some place.
Mohinder Dhillon and Kalwant Singh Dalla, India-Canada Culture and Heritage Association, interviewed in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
The flame which is burning in you, okay? That flame, I call that flame of belonging.
It's about being human. In its simplest form, the definition of human rights is based on respect for the dignity of every human being. Final written report, Content Advisory Committee.
The mind's like a parachute, functions best when open, and when it comes to transgendered people, it's a big stretch for a lot of people.
They made my grandmother and I sit in the middle of the floor in our cabin, and they made us sit there until my grandfather came home. And I can't tell you how many hours that was, but that's how we were treated.
Our school systems are failing us, and so those kids are ending up incarcerated. They're ending up in mental health facilities.
There is not one Human Rights Act in the entire country that talks about housing as a human right. So we wanted it here.
If you're inside the womb of a mother, you're technically, according to Canadian law, it's sort of up in the air whether or not you're a person.
It turns out that in Alberta,
you could be fired and you could be evicted because you were gay and there was nothing in human rights legislation to protect you.
We all do need a real education. The discrimination is bad for all time.
A series of young children from Joemi School, grade 4 class, Iqaluit Nunavut.
Same way as everyone else. Everyone has the right to be happy and have love in their family.
Everyone has the right to be respected.
Everyone has the right not to be slaves.
Everyone has the right to dream.
Everyone has the right to live. Everybody has the right to explore.
Everyone has the right to be free.
Everyone has the right to make new friends.
When I was 7 years old, I wanted to be a girl guide so bad.
Sharon Murphy, Canada Without Poverty, interviewed in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
I couldn't be a girl guide because my parents couldn't afford the uniform. And I remember going over, waiting for the girls to get out of their meeting and looking in the window of where they were at church, where they were meeting, and feeling, and this stays with you, this feeling of being on the outside, looking in.
They are looked upon as...
Zarina Mula works with drug addicts, 4 Pillars drug strategy, interviewed in Vancouver, BC.
...to have around, and so they're sort of put away in a corner somewhere.
When I arrived as a lesbian in the 60s, I looked for books and movies on lesbianism, but they didn't exist. Diane Heffernan, filmmaker, interviewed in Montreal, Quebec. As 2 men in this society, we must constantly carve our space as far as parenting goes. I think we will always have to start again. Gary Sutherland, LGBT Family Coalition, interviewed in Montreal, Quebec. There is a fear that exists, and I think that if this fear dissipates, you will begin to see integration. But integration is not just about smiling. Smiling doesn't pay the bills. Cyprien Okana, Association Patrimoine Interculturel, interviewed in Moncton, New Brunswick.
When I'm turned away from an establishment or denied entrance.
Yvonne Peters, Manitoba Human Rights Commission, interviewed in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Doesn't necessarily grow back.
So for a long time, I largely avoided situations and social settings where...
Thomas Polson, Momo Mixed Ability Dance Theatre, interviewed in Calgary, Alberta.
Where I might want to dance. I mean, I might have gone to them, but I would stay away from something that I loved, which was dance.
What you want is for everybody to feel a sense of...
Elaine Condon, Provincial Advisory Council on the Status of Women, interviewed in St. John's, Newfoundland.
It's good for women to be able to then do that with anything in their lives, right? It gives them more confidence to address anything.
There's always a bit of a war between people who see...
Jim Dirksen, Council of Canadians with Disabilities, interviewed in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
What they're able to produce, how they're able to relate and communicate. The other part of you, which puts value on just being or existing, is sometimes not winning the day.
People need to be reassured that who they are matters.
Evelina Pan, Thunder Bay and District Labour Council, interviewed in Toronto, Ontario.
Whatever they have to go through, that they're treated as human beings.
It's about acknowledging pain. As long as any group of people is deemed to be less than human, then we all face threats to humanity. Final written report, Content Advisory Committee.
It's hard to describe the life and filth, the dirt and lice. People were taken out.
Sydney Singeiser, Holocaust survivor, interviewed in Calgary, Alberta.
Shot in the neck. And we had to bury them. We had to, and always being aware that it could happen to you tomorrow.
There was no one to turn to. You know.
Berna Baror, sister of murdered women, interviewed in Edmonton, Alberta.
She was just another drunken Indian. And nobody, but she she only went out occasionally. And like I said, when they found her body and they did an autopsy, there was no alcohol in her blood.
Ashley was left on the floor to choke to death.
Coralie Cusack-Smith, mother of Ashley Smith, 19, who died in federal prison for women, interviewed in Moncton, New Brunswick.
Wrist up to the elbows, just big cries for help, and Ashley was not helped.
They told me, you know, your name is nobody.
Kelly Watt, survivor of non-state torture, interviewed in Toronto, Ontario.
What we wish.
They threw the body. Pile of bodies.
Bronya Singeiser, Holocaust survivor, mother and sister died 2 weeks before liberation, interviewed in Calgary, Alberta.
And a friend of my mother's came and she took me away from there.
You really feel like the war.
Marta Hernandez, sister disappeared in Guatemala in 1980, interviewed in Toronto, Ontario.
To learn, to keep going, to keep learning, like life continues, you know. I think that's the worst part.
I hated everybody. I mean,
Roger Ellis, residential school survivor, interviewed in Whitehorse, Yukon Territory.
Anybody that wasn't Native, I hated.
We had to relearn how to be human, how to have normal emotions.
Robbie Wiseman, Holocaust survivor, interviewed in Vancouver, British Columbia.
The expert believed that we saw too much and we would never rehabilitate. The experts had it wrong. The human spirit is so amazing that you can overcome great obstacles.
It's about resilience. Vigilance, courage, determined action, and an imagination for what is right are required to secure the promise of human rights for all. Final written report, Content Advisory Committee. The Acadian people decided to live. They did not accept this deportation, this genocide. And the only way to fight against the genocide is to remain standing, to stay alive. Antonine Maillet, writer, interviewed in Montreal, Quebec.
The last thing in the world my father would have wanted me to be would be...
Arthur Tekjiam, Armenian National Committee of Canada, interviewed in Vancouver, British Columbia.
Because they had hatred as their foundation.
The real challenge for all of us as human beings is to go inward to find...
Dave Coshen Jr., United Nations Interface Committee, interviewed in Winnipeg, Alberta.
They don't take that responsibility away from you to decide what you want to be and who you want to be, because that is all inside of you. But do you have the courage to live that spirit of who you are?
It was one coach, one woman, that created a space that was...
Mark Tewksbury, Olympic gold medalist, interviewed in Calgary, Alberta.
How did that feel for you? And I was like, you want my input? You know, it was so astonishing. And it was that subtle shift of opening the door to hear how I felt.
What can we do to help people?
Dolores Sandoval, professor artist, interviewed in Montreal, Quebec.
Human rights fundamentally are the recognition that we
Mark Cully, teacher, Gordon Bell High School, interviewed in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
That although we are different, we have our humanity in common. And every time you tell a story and it's heard, you reinforce that fact, that we have something in common, something really fundamental, and we can prove it every time we create this magic space between us.
Thank you to all of you who shared your stories. We invite others to do the same. For a copy of the CAC written report, please visit www.humanrightsmuseum.ca.
Despite our differences, the two most common issues are around...
Executive producer, Sylvia Hamilton. Director, Niger Blankenberg. Editor, Brendan Woods. Production houses, Edge Cinematography, Cinegraph, Locus Spect, Provision Graphics Inc., Dominique Gousset, Atigo Media, Cinegraph, Argus Films, Wesley Van Gelderen, Atlantic Audiovisuals, Sugnal Resources, Odyssey Productions, Real-Time Video Works, Eclectic Productions, Strongfront Productions, Midcan, Terry Wolf. Additional interviews, Sarah Arana, Angela Cassie, Sylvia Hamilton, Lise Harris. We could include and try to encourage participation from artists, musicians, poets, etc., that they come to a stop for this museum. Special thanks to Isra Al-Salem, Sarah Arana, Angela Cassie, Lise Harris, Gail Lord, and Lindsay Whedon. It's about hope.